Every man carries the ghost of his mother's voice, but Silas Granger hadn't heard his in 30 years. Some wounds never heal, they just get buried under money and power until you forget they're there. Silas owned half of Colorado Territory by the time most men learned to shave. Cattle baron, land mogul, a man whose word carried weight in every saloon from Denver to Durango. But there was one question that followed him like a shadow. What really happened to his mother? She'd gone mad when he was just a boy, locked away in the territorial asylum. Then one autumn evening, a barefoot woman in a dirt-stained nightgown appeared at his gates. She spoke his name the way only one person ever had. His mother had returned, and she wanted him to follow her home. What was waiting in that abandoned house would force Silas to confront a truth that threatened everything he'd built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Granger Ranch sprawled across 20,000 acres of Colorado Territory, like a kingdom carved from stone and stubborn will. From his study window on the second floor of the main house, Silas could see cattle dotting the valley floor like scattered coins, each one representing another dollar in his ever-growing fortune. The morning sun painted the distant mountains purple and gold, a sight that would have taken his breath away as a boy. Now, at 43, it was simply the view from his empire. Behind his massive oak desk hung the ornate land deed that had started it all, his father's original claim to this valley, written in careful script on parchment that had yellowed with age. The document bore the territorial seal and his father's bold signature, Thomas Granger, dated 1847. Below it, amendment after amendment showed how Silas had expanded that modest 200-acre claim into the vast holding it was today. Some acquired through shrewd negotiation, others through methods that kept him awake on particularly quiet nights. Silas pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, where beneath stacks of contracts and correspondence, a small object lay wrapped in black velvet. His fingers hesitated before lifting out the tarnished silver locket, the only physical reminder of his mother he'd allowed himself to keep. He didn't open it. He never opened it. Just held its familiar weight in his palm while memories he'd spent decades burying tried to claw their way to the surface. "Boss?" The voice belonged to Miguel Santos, his foreman for the past 15 years. A weathered man in his 50s with hands that spoke of honest work and eyes that held the wisdom of someone who'd seen the territory change from wild frontier to something approaching civilization. Silas quickly returned the locket to its hiding place and looked up. "Come in, Miguel." The foreman stepped into the study, hat in hand, his boots making soft sounds on the Persian rug that had cost more than most men earned in a year. "The Henderson boys are here about those steers you wanted moved to the north pasture, and there's a fellow from the railroad company waiting downstairs. Says it's about the right-of-way through Eagle Canyon." Silas nodded, his mind already shifting to business. The railroad wanted access through his land to connect their Denver line with the mining camps further west. It would be profitable, but it would also change the character of the valley forever. Progress had a way of trampling the past, and sometimes Silas wondered if that was such a bad thing. "Tell the Henderson boys to move those steers at first light tomorrow, and send the railroad man up in 10 minutes. I want to finish reviewing these contracts first." Miguel lingered in the doorway. In their years together, the foreman had learned to read his boss's moods like weather patterns. "You seem troubled today, boss. Everything all right?" Silas appreciated Miguel's concern, but there were corners of his past that remained locked even from his most trusted friend. "Just thinking about expansion plans. Nothing that should concern you." "If you say so." Miguel turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and boss? Cookie says there's a woman been asking around town about you. Old woman, according to what he heard at the general store. Might want to keep an eye out for that." The words hit Silas like a physical blow, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "What kind of questions?" Don't rightly know, just that she was asking about the Granger family, seemed particularly interested in the old homestead up in Pine Valley. Cookie thought you should know. After Miguel left, Silas sat motionless for several minutes, his hands flat on the desk's polished surface. Pine Valley. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years. The place where he'd been born, where his family had lived before. He forced the thought away, focusing instead on the contract in front of him, a delivery agreement for beef cattle to the mining camps. Numbers and signatures, profit and loss. These were things he could control. The past was a luxury he'd given up long ago. The railroad representative proved to be a thin man named Cornelius Webb, with nervous eyes and a tendency to fidget with his pocket watch. He spread maps across Silas's desk, pointing out proposed routes with a trembling finger. As you can see, Mr. Granger, the most efficient path would take us right through the heart of your property. We're prepared to offer very generous compensation for the easement rights. Silas studied the maps, noting how the proposed route would cut across some of his finest grazing land. More troubling was the way it would bring strangers through his domain. Travelers, workers, people asking questions about the valley's history. How many workers would this construction require? Oh, quite a crew. Perhaps 200. Men over the course of 6 months. They'd need temporary housing, supply lines. No. Silas's voice cut through Webb's enthusiasm like a blade. I beg your pardon. I said no. Find another route. Webb's face flushed red. But Mr. Granger, the compensation we're offering is extremely generous, more than fair market value. Mr. Webb, I don't need your money. I need my privacy. Good day. The railroad man gathered his maps with shaking hands, muttering under his breath about stubborn ranchers and missed opportunities. Silas watched him leave from his window, noting how the man's horse kicked up dust as they rode toward town. More dust meant more questions, and questions were something Silas had learned to avoid. As evening approached, he made his usual rounds of the property. The stable hands touched their hats respectfully as he passed. The cook waved from the kitchen window, and the ranch dogs followed at his heels like loyal subjects. This was his world, ordered, profitable, and blessedly quiet about the past. But as he stood on his front porch, watching the sun disappear behind the western peaks, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Call it instinct honed by years of dangerous business dealings, or simply the unease that had been growing in his chest since Miguel mentioned the woman asking questions. He thought again of the locket in his desk drawer, of the mother who had sung him lullabies in a voice like honey over warm bread. Mary Catherine Granger, who used to braid wildflowers into crowns for his head and tell him stories about brave knights and distant kingdoms. The same woman who, one terrible winter when he was 12, had begun talking to people who weren't there and screaming at shadows that only she could see. The asylum had taken her on a gray February morning. He remembered watching from his bedroom window as they loaded her into the back of a wagon, her hands bound and her hair wild around her face. She'd looked up at his window once, just before they drove away, and mouthed the word, sorry. That was 30 years ago. The asylum had burned down 15 years later, taking most of its records, and according to what Silas had been told, most of its patients with it. He'd paid good money over the years to ensure that particular chapter of his family's history stayed buried. Now, as he prepared for bed in his mansion built on 20,000 acres of success, Silas Granger tried to convince himself that one old woman asking questions in town was nothing to worry about. After all, his mother was dead, had been for years. Whatever ghost was stirring up the past would find nothing but dust and forgotten stories. He was wrong, of course, but he wouldn't discover that until the next evening, when the impossible walked through his front gates wearing nothing but a dirt-stained nightgown and 30 years of buried truth. The first snow of autumn was dusting the peaks when she appeared at his gates. Silas had been reviewing ledgers in his study when one of the ranch hands came pounding on his door, face white as fresh paint, Boss, you need to come see this. There's a woman at the front gate and she's asking for you by name. Tell her to make an appointment through Miguel during business hours. Boss, I don't think you understand. She's barefoot, wearing nothing but a nightgown, and she keeps saying, "Tell Silas his mama's come home." The ledger book slipped from Silas's hands, hitting the floor with a sound like a gunshot. He was moving before he'd fully processed the words, pushing past the ranch hand and taking the stairs 3 at a time. By the time he reached the front porch, his heart was hammering against his ribs like a caged animal. At the wrought iron gates that marked the entrance to his property, a figure stood silhouetted against the dying light. Even from 50 yards away, Silas could see that everything the ranch hand had said was true. The woman wore a dirt-stained nightgown that hung loose on her thin frame, her feet bare and muddy despite the October chill. Her hair, gray as winter clouds, hung in tangled strands around her shoulders, but it was the way she stood, patient and still, as if she had all the time in the world, that made his breath catch in his throat. Silas forced himself to walk slowly down the gravel drive, each step feeling like it carried the weight of 30 years. The woman didn't move, didn't call out, just watched him approach with eyes that seemed to hold depths he'd forgotten existed. When he was close enough to see her face clearly, the world tilted sideways. It was her. Older, weathered by time and hardship, but unmistakably his mother. The same high cheekbones, the same determined set to her jaw. The same eyes, green as spring grass, that had watched over him through childhood fevers and nightmares. "Hello, my sweet boy." Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, soft and warm despite the cold air between them. 3 decades vanished in an instant, and Silas was 12 years old again, standing in their old kitchen while she sang over the stove. "You're dead." The words came out strangled, barely recognizable as his own voice. "They told me you died in the fire. The asylum burned." "Oh, Silas." She reached through the gate's bars, her fingers inches from his face. "So many lies they told you, so many lies I had to let them tell." His hands shook as he fumbled with the gate's latch. The metal was cold under his fingers, real and solid, while nothing else in the world seemed to make sense anymore. The gate swung open with a creak that sounded like a door opening on the past. Mary Catherine Granger stepped onto her son's property for the first time in 3 decades. She was smaller than he remembered, more fragile, but there was steel in her eyes that spoke of survival against impossible odds. "How?" The question came out as a whisper. "That's a long story, son, and not one for standing out here in the cold." She looked around at the mansion, the manicured grounds, the obvious wealth that surrounded them. "You've done well for yourself. Better than I dared hope." Silas couldn't move, couldn't think past the impossibility of her presence. "The fire at the asylum. I wasn't there when it burned. Haven't been there for years." Her smile was sad and knowing. "There are things you need to understand, Silas. Things they made sure you'd never learn while I was locked away." "Mother." The word felt strange on his tongue after so many years of refusing to speak it. "I know this is a shock. I know you have questions, but there isn't time to explain everything here." She looked back toward the mountains where shadows were growing long between the peaks. "We need to go to the old place." To where it all began. The homestead? Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. That place has been abandoned for 30 years. Abandoned, yes, but not empty. Mary Catherine reached out and touched his face with fingers that felt like paper and bone. "There are things hidden there. Things they tried to bury when they put me away. Things you deserve to know." The rational part of Silas's mind screamed warnings. This woman could be anyone, a confidence artist, someone who'd learned his family history and was playing on his emotions. But his heart recognized her in ways that had nothing to do with logic. The way she said his name, The familiar gesture of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The scar on her left hand from when she'd cut herself making his 13th birthday cake. I don't understand any of this. You will. She stepped back, and he saw that despite her apparent frailty, there was purpose in her movements. But not here, not where they might be watching. Who might be watching? Instead of answering, she began walking back toward the road. Get your horse, Silas. We need to reach the old house before full dark. Wait. He caught up with her in 2 quick strides. You can't just appear after 30 years and expect me to follow you into the wilderness based on nothing but... She stopped and turned to face him fully. In the growing twilight, her eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. Do you remember the song I used to sing when you couldn't sleep? Without waiting for his answer, she began to hum, a low, sweet melody that reached into the deepest corners of his memory and pulled out images he'd thought were lost forever. His mother's voice floating through the cabin walls, her hand on his forehead, the feeling of being completely, utterly safe. Sleep now, my darling, the day's work is done, she sang softly. Tomorrow will bring us new hope with the sun. But tonight you are mine, and I'll keep you from harm, safe in your mama's protecting arms. Silas felt his knees go weak. He was the only person alive who could have known that song. She'd made it up, herself, singing it to him night after night during the years before she was taken away. How is this possible? He whispered. Because sometimes the truth is stronger than the lies people tell to bury it. She resumed walking toward the road. Are you coming, son? Or are you going to let them win after all these years? 20 minutes later, Silas sat astride his best horse while his mother climbed onto the back of an old mare that one of his ranch hands had saddled without question. She handled the reins with the same natural grace he remembered from childhood, when she'd been the finest rider in 3 counties. As they rode away from his mansion, away from his ordered world of ledgers and contracts and carefully managed reputation, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving more than just his property behind. Whatever waited for them at the old homestead, whatever truth his mother had spent 30 years protecting, he sensed it would change everything. The nightgown she wore fluttered in the evening breeze like a banner of surrender, and Silas found himself following it into the gathering darkness, toward answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. They rode in silence for the first hour, their horses' hooves marking steady time against the packed earth of the mountain trail. Silas kept glancing sideways at his mother, half expecting her to vanish like a fever dream. But she remained solid and real beside him, her gray hair catching moonlight as they climbed higher into the foothills. The path they followed was one Silas hadn't taken in decades, a narrow track that wound through pine groves and across rocky meadows, leading to the valley where he'd spent the first 12 years of his life. With each mile, memories pressed closer to the surface like air bubbles rising through deep water. You're quiet, son. His mother's voice carried easily in the thin mountain air. She rode with the same easy confidence, he remembered, as if 30 years in an asylum hadn't dimmed her ability to read the wilderness around them. I'm trying to understand how you're alive. Silas pulled his coat tighter against the growing cold. The asylum records were changed. She guided her horse around a fallen log with practiced ease, along with a lot of other things. Did you ever wonder why they moved so quickly to take me away? No trial, no examination by more than one doctor. The question stirred something uncomfortable in Silas's chest. He'd been 12 when it happened, old enough to sense that something wasn't right about the whole affair, but too young and too frightened to question the adults who'd taken control of his world. Dr. Morrison said you were dangerous, that you'd threaten to hurt yourself, and maybe me. Mary Catherine's laugh held no humor. Dr. Morrison. Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in years. She looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her years. Tell me, Silas, what do you remember about the weeks before they came for me? He closed his eyes, trying to reach back through the fog of deliberately forgotten memories. You'd been acting strangely, talking to yourself or to people who weren't there, Father was worried. Your father was dead by then. The words hit him like a physical blow. What? No, that's not. But even as he protested, images flickered through his mind. His father's funeral. The small wooden cross they'd placed on his grave. The way his mother had stood beside that grave, dry-eyed and furious instead of crying. He died in November. I was taken in February. 3 months, Silas. 3 months when it was just you and me in that cabin. But I remember him being there when you remember what you needed to remember to survive. Her voice was gentle but firm. A 12-year-old boy watching his mother dragged away by strangers needs to believe his father is still alive to protect him. Your mind gave you that gift. They had reached a ridge that looked down into Pine Valley, and Silas reined in his horse without conscious thought. Below them, barely visible in the moonlight, sat the ruins of his childhood home. The cabin looked smaller than he remembered, its roof partially collapsed and its walls dark with decades of weather. It looked so different. Everything looks different when you're not a child anymore. Mary Catherine dismounted and began loosening something from her saddlebags. But the bones of the place are the same. In her hands was a piece of paper, yellowed and creased from years of careful folding and unfolding. Even in the dim light, Silas could see that it was covered in a child's crude drawing. Stick figures standing in front of a simple house, with a yellow circle for the sun and a brown rectangle that might have been a dog. "You drew this the day before they took me away," she said, offering him the paper. "Do you remember?" His fingers trembled as he took the drawing. Looking at it was like stepping through a doorway into the past. He could suddenly recall sitting at the kitchen table with his tongue poking out in concentration, carefully coloring the sun with a stub of yellow crayon. "I'd forgotten. You drew our family. You, me, your father, even though he was already dead, and Buck, your old hound dog." She pointed to each figure in turn. "Happy family, you called it. Safe in their home. Why did you keep this?" "Because it reminded me what I was fighting to get back to." Mary Catherine folded the drawing carefully and tucked it back into her saddlebags. "During the worst times, when they had me so drugged I could barely remember my own name, I'd hold that picture and remember that somewhere out there was a little boy who'd drawn us all together." They remounted and continued down the slope toward the valley floor. As they rode, Silas found himself remembering things he'd spent decades burying. The sound of his father coughing up blood in the weeks before he died. The way his mother had grown thin and hollow-eyed after the funeral. The strange men who'd started coming by the cabin, asking questions about land boundaries and mineral rights. "The men who came asking about the land," he said suddenly. "I remember them now. They made you angry." "Furious." Mary Catherine's jaw tightened. "They wanted our property, Silas. Your father had been smart enough to file all the proper claims, but these men had found ways to challenge them. Legal ways, mostly. A few missing signatures, some survey markers that had mysteriously moved. But we owned the land fair and square. Ownership and possession are two different things, especially when you're a widow with a young son and no powerful friends to back you up." They'd reached the bottom of the valley, and she pulled her horse to a stop in front of the cabin. "I knew what they were planning. That's why I started acting strangely." "Acting strangely?" "Talking to your father's spirit. Making sure the neighbors heard me having conversations with thin air. Building a reputation for madness." Her smile was grim in the moonlight. "It's easier to commit someone who's already known to be unstable." The pieces were starting to come together in Silas's mind, forming a picture that made him sick to his stomach. "You weren't going mad. You were pretending to be mad." "At first, yes. But the line between pretending and reality gets thin when you're desperate and alone." She dismounted again, this time pulling a small bundle from her saddlebags. "I thought if I could just hold them off long enough, find some way to prove they were trying to steal our land. But they moved faster than you expected." Dr. Morrison was in their pocket from the beginning. It was remarkably easy to have an inconvenient woman declared insane in those days, especially when she was making wild claims about land theft and conspiracy. Silas stared at the ruined cabin that had once been his home, understanding flooding through him like cold water. Everything he'd built, everything he'd achieved, had grown from the soil of his mother's stolen land. His empire was rooted in her destruction. They got the property after you were committed. Sold for taxes 3 months later. Bought by a consortium of investors for pennies on the dollar. Mary Catherine walked toward the cabin's sagging door. "Come on, son. It's time you saw what they tried so hard to hide." The cabin door hung askew on rusted hinges, groaning in protest as Mary Catherine pushed it open. Moonlight slanted through holes in the roof, creating pools of silver on the warped floorboards. But despite 30 years of neglect, Silas could see that someone had been here recently. The debris had been cleared from certain areas, and there were signs of careful searching, boards pried up and replaced, stones moved from their original positions. "Someone's been looking for something," he observed, following his mother inside. "The same thing I've been looking for." Mary Catherine moved confidently through the darkness, her bare feet silent on the old wooden floor. "Your father was a careful man, Silas. He knew there were vultures circling our land even before he got sick." She knelt beside the stone fireplace and began running her hands along the mortar between the rocks. He kept records, documents, proof of what they were planning and how they meant to do it. Silas watched her search, memory overlaying the present like double-exposed photographs. He could see the room as it had been in his childhood, warm and alive with firelight, his mother's quilts draped over handmade furniture, the smell of cornbread and coffee always in the air. Now it was just a shell, picked clean by time and weather. If father hid something here, wouldn't they have found it by now? It's been 30 years. They've been looking, that's certain. But your father was smarter than they gave him credit for. Mary Catherine's fingers found something in the mortar, and she began working at it with her fingernails. He knew they were watching him, knew they'd search the obvious places. A small section of mortar crumbled away, revealing a gap between 2 stones. From the hiding place, Mary Catherine pulled a leather-wrapped bundle about the size of a book. The leather was dark with age, but had protected its contents from moisture and decay. "What is it?" Instead of answering, she unwrapped the bundle carefully. Inside was a journal bound in black leather, its pages filled with his father's familiar handwriting. Even in the dim light, Silas could make out dates, names, and detailed notes written in the precise script of a man who understood the importance of keeping accurate records. "Your father started keeping this journal when the first strangers came asking about our land boundaries," Mary Catherine explained, holding the journal like it was made of gold. "He documented every conversation, every suspicious incident, every attempt to intimidate or mislead us." She opened to a page near the beginning and read aloud. March 15th, 1851. "Man calling himself James Carter came by again today. Claims to represent Eastern investors interested in mineral rights. Offered to buy our claim for half what Thomas Morrison paid for his adjoining property. When I refused, he suggested I might want to reconsider, given how dangerous mining country can be for families with young children." Silas felt cold settle in his bones that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "They threatened us. They threatened all the small landholders in this valley. Your father documented dozens of similar incidents." Mary Catherine turned several pages, pointing to entries that detailed mysterious accidents, sudden illnesses among livestock, and survey markers that seemed to move in the night. "But this is evidence. Why didn't he take it to the territorial authorities?" "Because some of the territorial authorities were involved." She showed him a page where his father had drawn a crude map of the valley, with names written beside each property. Many of the names had been crossed out, with dates and notes. Morrison sold out May 3rd. Henderson family moved back east after barn fire. Widow Campbell committed for hysteria after claiming someone poisoned her well. The pattern was clear and chilling. One by one, the legitimate landowners had been driven out through intimidation, fraud, or convenient declarations of mental incompetence. Those who resisted too strongly often met with accidents or mysterious illnesses. They were stealing the entire valley and more. This was just the beginning. Mary Catherine turned to the back of the journal, where his father's handwriting became increasingly erratic, reflecting his deteriorating health. But your father figured out why they wanted this particular piece of land so badly. She pointed to an entry dated just weeks before Thomas Granger's death. Found the old Spanish survey markers today, buried under decades of soil erosion. The boundary lines aren't where the territorial maps show them. Our property includes the entire eastern slope of Eagle Mountain, including the mineral deposits that Carter's people think they're going to claim. Silas stared at the page, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. Our land was worth more than anyone knew. Worth a fortune in silver ore, according to your father's research, but only if someone could establish clear legal title to the mineral rights. Mary Catherine closed the journal carefully. That's why they needed to get rid of us. We were the only ones who could prove the territorial surveys were wrong. And when Father died, I became the only obstacle left. A grieving widow making wild claims about conspiracy and land theft. It was remarkably easy to paint me as hysterical, especially after I started my act of talking to your father's spirit. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of revelation settling between them like dust. Silas thought about his own empire, built on land acquired through what he'd always assumed were legitimate business deals. How much of his success was founded on property stolen from families like his own. There's more. Mary Catherine rewrapped the journal and tucked it inside her nightgown. Your father's research led him to something else, something that connects to people you know today. What do you mean? The consortium that bought our land after I was committed. Do you know who the investors were? Silas shook his head, though something cold was beginning to uncurl in his stomach. James Carter was just the front man. The real money came from a group of territorial officials, mining executives, and railroad interests. Mary Catherine stood, moving toward a corner of the room where the floorboards showed signs of recent disturbance. Men who went on to become very powerful in Colorado Territory. Men whose sons and grandsons still control much of the territory's wealth. She knelt and began working at a loose floorboard with her fingernails. Men like Cornelius Webb Sr., whose son just tried to buy an easement through your property yesterday. The floorboard came up with a soft creak, revealing a shallow hiding place beneath. Mary Catherine reached inside and pulled out a small object wrapped in oiled cloth. When she unwrapped it, moonlight glinted off metal and glass, a surveyor's compass, old but well-maintained. Your father used this to verify the true boundary lines of our property. The lines that prove your ranch sits on land that was legally ours first. She held the compass out to him. The question now, son, is what you're going to do with the truth. Silas took the compass with hands that trembled slightly, feeling its weight like he was holding a piece of his own history. The brass was tarnished but solid, and when he opened it, the needle swung true to magnetic north despite the years. His father's initials were engraved on the back. T.E.G., Thomas Edgar Granger. I remember him using this, Silas said quietly. He taught me to read it when I was 8 years old. Said a man should always know where he stands. He meant that in more ways than one. Mary Catherine watched him examine the instrument. Your father believed the truth had a way of coming to light. Given enough time, he hid that compass and his journal so that someday someone would be able to prove what really happened here. Outside, wind whistled through the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of coming snow. Silas found himself thinking about his conversation with Webb the day before, about the railroad's insistence on cutting through his land. Suddenly, the man's nervous energy made more sense. He wasn't just negotiating for an easement, he was trying to complete something his father had started 30 years ago. "The railroad route Webb showed me yesterday," Silas said slowly. "It would go right through this valley and give them access to the silver deposits your father discovered, deposits they've been trying to reach for 3 decades. Mary Catherine moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit valley. "They've been patient, I'll give them that, building their power, waiting for the right moment to finish what they started. But I own this land now. I bought it legally, from the territorial government, who sold it after it was seized for unpaid taxes." His mother's voice was gentle but implacable. Taxes that were assessed at 10 times the normal rate, based on survey boundaries that were deliberately falsified. The implications hit Silas like successive blows. His empire, everything he'd built, was founded on stolen property. Worse than that, it was built on property stolen from his own family. Every dollar he'd made, every acre he'd acquired, was tainted by the conspiracy that had destroyed his mother's life and killed his father as surely as if they'd put a gun to his head. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About me, I mean. About what I became. I've been keeping track of you since the day they locked me away." Mary Catherine's reflection in the broken window glass looked ghostly and sad. "It wasn't hard. The boy who lost his family to land grabbers grows up to become the most successful rancher in the territory. That kind of irony gets talked about even in asylum corridors. You must hate me." "Hate you?" She turned from the window, and Silas saw something in her eyes that might have been pride mixed with sorrow. "Son, you survived. You took the cards you were dealt and built something remarkable. The fact that it was built on stolen ground doesn't make you the thief." But Silas wasn't sure he agreed. Over the years, he'd acquired property through methods that weren't always entirely honorable. He'd pressured desperate farmers to sell at below-market prices, had used his influence to ensure certain surveys favored his claims, had made deals with territorial officials that benefited both parties at the expense of smaller landowners. "I've done things," he said quietly. "Things that weren't much different from what they did to us." "I know." Mary Catherine's voice was matter-of-fact. "Power corrupts, especially when it's built on a foundation of injustice. But that's why I'm here, Silas. That's why I spent 30 years staying alive in that hellhole instead of giving up and dying quietly." She pulled his father's journal from her nightgown and held it up in the moonlight. "This isn't just evidence of what they did to our family. It's proof of a pattern that's been going on for decades. A systematic theft of land and resources that's made a few men incredibly wealthy while destroying countless families." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that it's time to stop the cycle." Mary Catherine moved closer to him, and in the dim light she looked both fragile and fierce. "You have power now, Silas. Real power. The kind that can bring justice to people who've never had it, or destroy everything I've built." "Yes," she agreed simply. "It might do that too." They left the cabin as dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks, the compass and journal safely tucked away in Silas's saddlebags. The ride back to his ranch passed in contemplative silence, both of them lost in thoughts too large for casual conversation. As they descended from the mountains into his valley, Silas saw his property with new eyes. The neat pastures and well-maintained fences, the great house sitting like a crown jewel among the outbuildings, it all looked different now that he knew the blood price that had been paid for it. "What happened to the others?" he asked as they approached his gates. "The people who were driven out?" "Some died. Some moved on and started over somewhere else. A few ended up like me. Inconvenient truths, locked away where they couldn't cause trouble for powerful men." Mary Catherine's voice was steady, but Silas could hear decades of pain beneath the surface. "There's a woman in Denver, Sarah Kellerman, whose father owned the property where the Morrison mine operates now. She's been trying to prove her legal claim for 20 years, but every time she gets close to success, something happens. Evidence disappears, witnesses recant their testimony. judges rule against her on technicalities. You've been in contact with other victims? The asylum had its advantages. People talked, guards could be bribed, and over 30 years, you'd be amazed how much information finds its way even into the darkest corners. Mary Catherine smiled grimly. I wasn't the only person who was committed for asking inconvenient questions about land ownership. We formed our own little network of the officially insane. As they reached the ranch house, Silas saw Miguel waiting on the front porch, his face creased with worry. The foreman had obviously been up all night, and his relief at seeing his boss return safely was evident even from a distance. "Boss, thank God you're back. We've had visitors." Silas dismounted and helped his mother down from her horse, noting how the morning light made her look even more fragile than she had in moonlight. "What kind of visitors?" "Men from town. Said they were looking for an escaped lunatic. Dangerous woman who'd been making threats against prominent citizens." Miguel's eyes flicked to Mary Catherine, taking in her asylum nightgown and bare feet. "They wanted permission to search the property." "What did you tell them?" "That they'd need to come back with proper warrants. But boss—" Miguel lowered his voice. "One of them was Deputy Marshal Hawkins. He seemed real interested in whether you'd had any strange visitors lately." Mary Catherine stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly despite her obvious exhaustion. "They know I'm here. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Silas spent the morning pacing his study while his mother slept in the guest room he'd hastily prepared for her. Every few minutes he found himself pulling out his father's journal, reading entries that painted a picture of systematic corruption stretching back decades. The names mentioned in those careful notes read like a who's who of territorial power, men whose sons now sat in positions of authority, carrying on the family traditions of profitable injustice. Miguel knocked softly and entered with coffee and concern etched across his weathered features. "Boss, we need to talk about security. Word's already spreading in town about the woman who showed up here last night. People are asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests someone's been spreading stories about her being dangerous, that she's escaped from a private facility and might be violent." Miguel set the coffee cup down with deliberate care. "There's talk of organizing a search party, for public safety, they say." Silas moved to the window, watching the normal rhythm of ranch life continue in the yard below. His men went about their duties with the same steady competence they'd shown for years, but he could sense an undercurrent of tension. News traveled fast in cattle country, and by now every hand on the property knew something unusual was happening. "How much do you trust our men, Miguel?" "With my life. With yours too." The foreman's answer came without hesitation. "But boss, if the territorial marshal comes with papers—" "Then we'll deal with it when it happens." Silas turned from the window, his decision crystallizing. "I want you to send riders to the Henderson brothers and to old Frank Morrison. Tell them I need to meet with them tonight." "Privately." Miguel's eyebrows rose. The men Silas had named were among the most respected ranchers in the territory, but they weren't people he normally did business with. Their operations were smaller, their methods more traditional, and their politics considerably less flexible than Silas's usual associates. "May I ask why?" Before Silas could answer, another knock came at the door. This time it was one of the younger hands, his face flushed with excitement and worry. "Boss, there's a fancy carriage coming up the drive. Got territorial seals on it and everything." Through the window, Silas could see an elegant black carriage making its way toward the house, escorted by 4 mounted deputies. The territorial flag snapped in the autumn breeze, and even at a distance, he could make out the official bearing of the men surrounding the vehicle. "Miguel, I want you to take my mother out the back way. Get her to the old line shack up in Cedar Canyon. Keep her there until you hear from me directly." "Boss, do it now. And Miguel—" Silas met his foreman's eyes steadily. "Whatever happens here, whatever you see or hear, I need you to remember that woman is under my protection. Anyone who tries to harm her will answer to me personally." Miguel nodded once, a gesture that conveyed 30 years of loyalty and trust, then hurried from the room. Silas listened to his boots on the stairs, followed by quick, quiet voices and the soft sound of the back door closing. By the time the official carriage pulled to a stop in front of his house, his mother was safely away. The man who emerged from the carriage was someone Silas recognized but had never met personally: Territorial Governor Benjamin Hayes, a distinguished figure in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to wielding power. He was accompanied by Deputy Marshal Hawkins and 2 other men Silas didn't recognize. Silas met them on his front porch, projecting the calm confidence that had served him well in countless business negotiations. "Governor Hayes, this is an unexpected honor. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Mr. Granger," Hayes's smile was polite but cold. "I apologize for the intrusion, but we're dealing with a matter of public safety. We have reason to believe you may have encountered a dangerous individual who escaped from a private medical facility." "I'm not sure I understand." "A woman named Mary Catherine Granger. She was committed to the Riverside Sanitarium 15 years ago after the territorial Asylum fire, and she escaped 3 days ago. We have reports that she was seen in this area, and given that she shares your family name—" "Granger's a common enough name in these parts," Silas interrupted smoothly. "But I haven't seen any escaped lunatics on my property, Governor. I think I'd have noticed." Deputy Marshal Hawkins stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Mr. Granger, several witnesses in town reported seeing you ride out last night with a woman matching her description. A woman wearing nothing but a nightgown, they said." Silas felt the weight of his father's journal in his jacket pocket like a brand against his chest. "I'm afraid your witnesses are mistaken, Deputy. I did ride out last night to check on some cattle, but I was alone." "You won't mind if we search your property then," Hayes said. It wasn't really a question. "Actually, Governor, I would mind. This is private land, and unless you have proper warrants, we have reason to believe this woman poses an immediate danger to herself and others." Hayes produced a folded document from his coat. "This gives us authority to search any property where she might be hiding." Silas accepted the paper and made a show of reading it carefully. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. They had broad authority to search for Mary Catherine Granger and to detain anyone harboring her. The signature at the bottom belonged to Territorial Judge Morrison, whose grandfather had been one of the original landowners mentioned in his father's journal. "This seems to be in order," Silas said finally. "Though I'm curious why the territorial government is taking such an interest in one escaped patient. Surely this is a matter for local authorities." "Mrs. Granger has made serious accusations against prominent citizens," Hayes replied. "Accusations of conspiracy and fraud dating back decades. In her delusional state, she's become fixated on the idea that legitimate business dealings were somehow criminal in nature. Delusional accusations can be dangerous when they target respectable men," added one of the other officials. "They can inspire others to make similar claims, creating public unrest and undermining confidence in our territorial institutions." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Silas found himself thinking about Sarah Kellerman in Denver, still fighting for her father's stolen land after 20 years. How many others were there? How many people had been silenced or discredited to protect the conspiracy his mother had uncovered? "Of course," Silas said with a slight smile. "Public confidence is so important, isn't it? Especially when it comes to property rights and legitimate business dealings." Governor Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he was trying to read some hidden meaning in Silas's words. "Indeed it is, Mr. Granger. Indeed it is. Now, shall we begin the search?" The search of Silas's property took 2 hours and yielded nothing more than polite frustration from Governor Hayes and his men. They examined every building, questioned every ranch hand, and even checked the root cellar where Silas stored winter provisions. Through it all, Silas maintained his cooperative demeanor while his mind raced with questions about his mother's true purpose in returning. As the official party prepared to leave, Governor Hayes paused beside his carriage and fixed Silas with a steady gaze. "Mr. Granger, I hope you understand the seriousness of this situation. Mary Catherine Granger is not just mentally unstable, she's dangerous. If she contacts you, your duty as a citizen requires that you notify authorities immediately." "Of course, Governor. Though I have to ask, if this woman has been institutionalized for 30 years, how exactly is she dangerous now?" "Mental illness can manifest in many ways," Hayes replied smoothly. "Sometimes patients develop elaborate fantasies about being wronged by society. They become convinced that respected citizens are part of vast conspiracies against them. Such delusions can inspire violence against innocent people." After the officials departed, Silas waited a full hour before riding up to Cedar Canyon to retrieve his mother. He found her sitting calmly outside the line shack, still wearing the Asylum nightgown, but now wrapped in one of Miguel's spare coats. She looked up as he approached, and he was struck again by the strength in her eyes despite her frail appearance. "They're gone," he reported, dismounting. "But they'll be watching, and they made it clear that anyone helping you would be considered an accomplice to whatever crimes they think you might commit." Mary Catherine nodded as if she'd expected as much. "Did you recognize any of the men with Hayes?" "The deputy marshal, Hawkins. The others were strangers to me." "The thin man with the gold watch chain, that was Albert Morrison, Jr., son of the judge who signed your father's commitment papers and grandson of the original landowner they drove out of this valley." Mary Catherine stood slowly, her joints stiff from sitting on the hard ground. The younger man was probably Thomas Webb, Cornelius Webb's nephew. The family's been involved in this conspiracy from the beginning. "How do you know all this?" "Because I've spent 30 years learning everything I could about the people who destroyed our family." Mary Catherine's voice carried a weight of patient determination. "Did you think I was just sitting in that asylum, waiting for rescue? I've been preparing, son, building cases, gathering evidence, making contacts." She pulled a small object from the coat pocket. A key, old and tarnished, but obviously well maintained. "This opens a safety deposit box in the First National Bank of Denver. Box number 247, registered under the name Margaret Collins." Silas took the key, feeling its weight. "What's in the box?" 30 years of documentation, copies of land records, witness statements, correspondence between the conspirators, even some photographs. Mary Catherine began walking toward where he'd left the horses. "Everything I've managed to collect or steal over the years, with help from other victims and a few sympathetic guards who believed my story. If you have all this evidence, why didn't you use it years ago?" "Because I needed someone with power and influence to present it. Someone who couldn't be easily dismissed or discredited." She paused beside her horse, meeting his eyes directly. "Someone like the most successful rancher in Colorado Territory." The implication hit Silas like a physical blow. "You didn't escape from the asylum. You were released. This whole thing, your return, leading me to the cabin, showing me Father's journal, it's all been planned. Not released. But escape became possible when certain people decided I might be useful to them." Mary Catherine's smile held no warmth. "There are factions within the territorial government, Silas. Some people who are tired of watching a handful of families control all the land and resources while honest settlers get driven out or destroyed." "What factions?" "People who believe Colorado's statehood application should be based on legitimate prosperity, not wealth built on systematic theft." She mounted her horse with the same easy grace he remembered from childhood. "The federal government is taking a closer look at territorial affairs these days. Questions are being asked about land grants, mineral rights, and the rather convenient way certain properties seem to change hands." Silas felt the world shifting beneath him like unstable ground. "You're working with federal investigators." "I'm working with people who want justice, son. The fact that some of them happen to work for the federal government is simply convenient." Mary Catherine guided her horse closer to his. "The question is whether you're going to help us or continue protecting the system that destroyed your family." They rode back toward the ranch in tense silence, Silas's mind reeling with the implications of what he'd learned. His mother hadn't just escaped. She'd been deployed like a weapon aimed at the heart of the conspiracy that had shaped territorial politics for decades. Everything about her return, from the timing to the location, had been carefully orchestrated. But as they approached his property, Silas noticed something that made his blood run cold. Smoke was rising from the direction of his main barn, and he could hear men shouting in the distance. They spurred their horses forward, racing across the pasture toward the source of the disturbance. What they found when they crested the hill made Silas's heart stop. His prize barn was engulfed in flames, and his men were fighting desperately to keep the fire from spreading to other buildings. But that wasn't the worst of it. Miguel lay motionless near the corral fence, blood pooling beneath his head. Dr. Morrison, the same man who had committed his mother 30 years ago, now aged but still practicing, knelt beside the foreman with his medical bag open. "What happened?" Silas demanded, jumping from his horse before it had fully stopped. "Accident," Dr. Morrison said without looking up. "Your foreman was trying to move some equipment when a beam fell. Tragic, but these old barns can be dangerous." But Miguel's injuries didn't look like they'd come from falling timber. The wound on the back of his head was too neat, too precise, and there was something in Dr. Morrison's manner, a satisfaction poorly disguised as professional concern, that set every instinct Silas possessed on high alert. Will he live? Hard to say. Head injuries are unpredictable. He may never regain consciousness. Morrison closed his bag with deliberate care. Of course, even if he does wake up, trauma like this often affects memory. He may not remember anything about today. The threat was subtle but clear. Miguel had seen something, probably the real cause of the fire and his own assault, and now he was being silenced in the most permanent way possible. Mary Catherine dismounted and walked calmly toward the doctor, her bare feet silent on the ground. When she was close enough to touch him, she spoke in a voice that carried across the yard despite its quiet tone. "Hello, Arthur. It's been a long time." Dr. Morrison's face went white as winter snow. He dropped his medical bag, instruments scattering across the ground, and took an involuntary step backward. "You're supposed to be dead," he whispered. "Supposed to be, yes. But as you can see, I'm very much alive." Mary Catherine smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who had waited 30 years for this moment. "And I remember everything, Arthur. Every injection you gave me. Every time you told visitors I was too dangerous to see. Every lie you told to keep me buried in that place. You were insane. You threatened people. I threatened to expose the truth, which made me very inconvenient for you and your associates." Mary Catherine stepped closer, and Dr. Morrison stumbled backward. "But now I'm free, and I have proof of everything you did, everything you all did." The doctor's eyes darted toward the ranch hands who were still fighting the fire, then back to Mary Catherine. "No one will believe you. You're a convicted lunatic. Your testimony is worthless." "Perhaps. But what about the testimony of a respected businessman? Someone whose word carries weight in territorial courts?" Mary Catherine glanced meaningfully at Silas. "What do you think my son will say when he learns you just tried to murder his foreman to cover up your involvement in burning down his barn?" Dr. Morrison's gaze swung to Silas, and in that moment the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. The fire hadn't been an accident, and Miguel's injury hadn't been caused by falling timber. They'd been sent to search for evidence, and when they didn't find Mary Catherine, they'd decided to send a different kind of message. "Get off my property," Silas said quietly. "Now see here, get off my property before I decide to settle this the way we used to settle things 30 years ago." Silas's hand moved to the gun at his hip. "And doctor, if my foreman dies, I'll be paying you another visit, a much less pleasant one." As Morrison hurried away, Silas knelt beside Miguel and checked his pulse. The foreman was alive but unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Whatever happened next, Silas knew there was no going back to his carefully ordered world of profitable neutrality. The war his parents had fought and lost 30 years ago was about to begin again. And this time, Silas intended to win it. Miguel regained consciousness 3 days later, his memory intact despite Dr. Morrison's predictions. The first words out of his mouth were a warning. "Boss, they're planning something big. I heard them talking before they knocked me out." Silas leaned forward in the chair beside Miguel's bed, where he'd spent most of the past 72 hours keeping vigil. "Who? What did you hear?" "Morrison and 2 men I didn't recognize. They were talking about a territorial hearing scheduled for next week. Something about land grants being reviewed by federal investigators." Miguel tried to sit up, wincing as the movement sent pain through his skull. "They're worried, boss. Real worried. Said if certain records come to light, it could bring down half the territorial government." Mary Catherine, who had been sitting quietly by the window, turned to face them. In the 3 days since the barn fire, she had transformed from the fragile woman in an asylum nightgown into something far more formidable. Wearing clothes borrowed from the cook's daughter and with her gray hair braided neatly behind her head, she looked like what she truly was, a woman who had survived 30 years of hell and emerged unbroken. "The hearing is why they moved against us so quickly," she said. "They know I have evidence that could destroy them, but they also know that without someone credible to present it, my testimony won't carry much weight. But with me backing your claims, you become their primary target." Mary Catherine moved away from the window, her expression grave. "They've already tried intimidation and violence. What comes next will be worse." As if summoned by her words, one of the ranch hands appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from hard riding. "Boss, you need to come see this. There's an army of men riding up from town. Must be 50 of them, maybe more." From the bedroom window, Silas could see the dust cloud long before he could make out individual riders. As the group drew closer, he counted at least 60 mounted men, many of them wearing deputy badges, but others clearly civilian volunteers. At their head rode Governor Hayes, Deputy Marshal Hawkins, and a man Silas didn't recognize, but who wore the uniform of a federal marshal. "A federal marshal?" Mary Catherine observed, joining him at the window. "That's interesting. Either they've convinced federal authorities that I'm genuinely dangerous, or what? Or someone in the federal government wants to see how far these people will go to protect their secrets." Her smile was grim but satisfied. Sometimes the only way to expose corruption is to let it reveal itself. The massive group of riders stopped just outside Silas's property line, close enough to be threatening but not close enough to be trespassing. Governor Hayes rode forward alone, stopping just inside the gate. "Mr. Granger," Hayes called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "We have reliable information that you are harboring a dangerous fugitive. We're prepared to offer you one last chance to surrender her peacefully." Silas stepped out onto his front porch, his hands empty but his gun belt clearly visible. Behind him, he could sense his ranch hands taking positions at windows and doorways. These were good men, loyal and brave, but they were cattlemen, not soldiers. Against 60 armed riders, they wouldn't stand a chance in a straight fight. "Governor, as I told you before, there are no fugitives on my property. Mr. Granger, lying to territorial authorities is a serious crime, but harboring an escaped mental patient who has made threats against government officials, that's potentially treasonous." Hayes's voice took on a note of false regret. "I'm afraid we're going to have to search your property more thoroughly this time." The federal marshal rode forward to join Hayes. He was a tall man with steel-gray hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent years dealing with frontier justice. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of the United States government. "Mr. Granger, I'm Federal Marshal James Caldwell. I have orders to investigate certain irregularities in territorial land grants and mineral rights. I understand you may have information relevant to my investigation. Silas felt his mother's hand touch his shoulder as she stepped out onto the porch behind him. She had wrapped herself in a shawl that concealed most of her features, but there was no mistaking her presence. "Marshal Caldwell," she said in a clear, strong voice, "I am Mary Catherine Granger. I believe you've been looking for me." The effect of her words on the assembled riders was immediate and electric. Governor Hayes's face went white, while several of the civilian volunteers began muttering among themselves. Only Marshal Caldwell seemed unsurprised by her appearance. "Mrs. Granger, I've been very interested in speaking with you about certain documents that have come into federal possession, documents relating to land fraud and conspiracy dating back 30 years. "What documents?" Hayes demanded, his composure cracking. "Bank records from Denver showing payments made to territorial officials for fraudulent land assessments. Correspondence between mining companies and government surveyors discussing falsified boundary markers. Witness statements from Asylum staff detailing the systematic silencing of inconvenient landowners." Caldwell's voice was matter-of-fact, but his words hit the assembled group like bombshells. "Those are fabrications," Hayes protested. "Delusions created by a mentally unstable woman. Actually, Governor, many of them have been corroborated by other sources, including records we found in a safety deposit box in Denver." Caldwell reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a familiar leather journal. "This, for instance, appears to be a detailed account of land fraud written by Thomas Granger in the months before his death. Very illuminating reading." Mary Catherine had played her final card. Somehow she had gotten the evidence to federal investigators before returning to confront the conspiracy that had destroyed her family. The safety deposit box key she'd given Silas was probably a duplicate. The real contents were already in federal hands. "This is all very interesting," Silas said carefully, "but I'm not sure why you need to search my property with 60 armed men." "Because," Governor Hayes said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "this woman has made threats against territorial officials. She's dangerous and unpredictable." "The only thing I've threatened to do is tell the truth," Mary Catherine interrupted. "But I understand why that would terrify you, Benjamin. Truth has a way of destroying men who've built their lives on lies." The standoff stretched for long minutes, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Silas could see some of the civilian volunteers beginning to look uncertain, as if they were starting to question what they'd been told about the dangerous fugitive they'd come to capture. Finally, Marshal Caldwell spoke. "Mrs. Granger, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. There are federal officials who need to take your formal statement." "Of course, Marshal. I've been waiting 30 years for someone to officially listen to what I have to say." "You can't just take her," Silas protested. "She's under my protection." "And she'll remain under federal protection until this matter is resolved," Caldwell assured him. "Unlike some territorial officials, the federal government takes accusations of systematic fraud very seriously." As Mary Catherine prepared to leave with Marshal Caldwell, she pulled Silas aside for a private word. "There's one more thing you need to know, son. Something I haven't told you yet." "What?" "The silver deposits your father found on our original land. They're still there. Still unclaimed under federal mining law, because the territorial grants that supposedly transferred ownership were based on fraudulent surveys." Her eyes gleamed with fierce satisfaction. "When this all comes out in court, when the conspiracy is exposed and the fraudulent land grants are invalidated, that property reverts to its original owners." I mean you're about to become even richer than you already are, son. Legitimately this time." She squeezed his hand. "Your father would be proud of what you've built, but he'd be prouder still of what you're about to tear down." As the federal marshal's party rode away with Mary Catherine safely in their protection, Governor Hayes and his remaining followers found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. The civilian volunteers began drifting away in small groups, clearly uncomfortable with their role in what was beginning to look less like law enforcement and more like attempted intimidation of federal witnesses. "This isn't over," Hayes warned Silas as he prepared to leave. "No, Governor," Silas agreed. "I don't think it is. But when it is over, I suspect the territorial political landscape is going to look very different." That evening, as Silas stood in his study looking out at the valley where he'd built his empire, he thought about the choices that lay ahead. He could try to distance himself from his mother's revelations, protect his own interests and let justice take whatever course it would. Or he could throw his considerable wealth and influence behind the federal investigation, helping to ensure that the conspiracy that had destroyed his family was finally brought to light. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. His mother had spent 30 years in hell to preserve the truth. The least he could do was help her deliver it. Tomorrow, he would ride to Denver and meet with federal investigators. He would turn over his father's journal and surveyor's compass, add his testimony to his mother's, and watch as the house of cards that was territorial politics finally collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. But tonight, he would prepare for war. The federal hearing in Denver drew spectators from across Colorado Territory. Word had spread that the most powerful men in the region were about to be called to account for decades of systematic land fraud, and the courtroom was packed with ranchers, miners, and settlers who had their own grievances against territorial authorities. Silas arrived at the federal courthouse on a gray November morning, wearing his finest suit and carrying his father's journal and surveyor's compass in a leather satchel. He'd spent the past week in Denver, meeting with federal investigators and providing detailed testimony about everything his mother had revealed. Now came the public reckoning. Federal Marshal Caldwell met him on the courthouse steps. "Are you ready for this, Mr. Granger? Once you testify, there'll be no going back. These men have long memories and deep pockets." "I've been ready for 30 years, Silas replied. "I just didn't know it until now." Inside the courtroom, the territorial power structure was arrayed like an army under siege. Governor Hayes sat at the defendant's table alongside Judge Morrison, Dr. Morrison, Cornelius Webb Jr., and half a dozen other prominent citizens whose names had appeared in Thomas Granger's careful documentation. Their lawyers filled 2 entire rows, and Silas could see the worry beneath their confident facades. But it was the sight of his mother that took his breath away. Mary Catherine sat at the witness table wearing a simple but elegant dress donated by sympathetic federal officials. Her gray hair was arranged in a neat bun, and she held herself with the dignity of someone who had endured hell and emerged victorious. When she looked at him, her smile conveyed 30 years of love and pride. Federal Judge Harrison called the hearing to order, his voice carrying the authority of a government that was finally taking territorial corruption seriously. "This hearing has been convened to investigate allegations of systematic land fraud, conspiracy to defraud legitimate property owners, and abuse of territorial authority spanning the period from 1850 to the present day." The prosecution began with Mary Catherine's testimony. She spoke in a clear, steady voice as she detailed her family's persecution, her husband's murder by slow poison, and her own illegal commitment to silence her accusations. She presented evidence methodically: bank records, correspondence, witness statements from other victims, building an unshakable case of conspiracy that reached into every level of territorial government. "My husband documented everything," she said, holding up Thomas Granger's journal. "He knew they were planning to destroy us, so he preserved the evidence. He hid it where he hoped someday our son would find it and finish what we started." When Governor Hayes's lawyer cross-examined her, he tried to paint her as a woman driven mad by grief, prone to paranoid fantasies about non-existent conspiracies. But Mary Catherine remained unshakable, answering each question with facts and dates and names that could be verified by independent sources. "Mrs. Granger," the lawyer said with practiced condescension, "isn't it true that you were committed to the territorial asylum because you were making wild accusations against respected citizens?" "I was committed because I discovered proof of land fraud and mineral theft. That's very different from being insane, though I understand why you might want to confuse the two." Her response drew murmurs of approval from the packed gallery. Then came Silas's turn to testify. As he walked to the witness stand, he could feel the weight of history on his shoulders. Everything his family had lost, everything they'd endured, led to this moment. "Mr. Granger," the federal prosecutor began, "please tell the court how you came to possess the evidence your mother has presented." Silas testified about his mother's return, their journey to the abandoned homestead, and the discovery of his father's hidden records. He spoke about the intimidation tactics used against him, the burning of his barn, and the assault on his foreman. Most importantly, he confirmed that the surveyor's compass proved the territorial boundary maps were deliberately falsified. Based on your father's surveys and your own knowledge of the land, what is your assessment of the mineral wealth contained in the fraudulently claimed properties? Conservative estimates suggest silver deposits worth at least $2 million at current market prices. The figure caused a stir in the courtroom. My father discovered the main vein in 1851, but the conspirators couldn't access it legally while our family held clear title to the land. During cross-examination, Governor Hayes's lawyer tried to suggest that Silas was motivated by greed, seeking to reclaim valuable property through false accusations. "Mr. Granger, isn't it convenient that these allegations would potentially make you one of the wealthiest men in the territory?" "Sir, I'm already one of the wealthiest men in the territory. What I'm seeking here isn't money. It's justice for my family and every other family that was destroyed by this conspiracy." The lawyer pressed harder. "But you built your own fortune using some of the same aggressive tactics you now condemn." "That's exactly right." Silas's admission surprised everyone in the courtroom. "I became part of a system I didn't understand, using methods I thought were just business. Learning the truth about how that system was created doesn't make me proud of my own participation in it." His honesty seemed to catch the defense off guard. They had expected denials and self-justification, not a wealthy man willing to acknowledge his own moral failures in pursuit of a larger truth. The defense's case collapsed like a house built on sand. One by one, their witnesses either refused to testify or provided statements that contradicted the official narrative they'd maintained for decades. Dr. Morrison, called to defend his medical decisions, instead found himself exposed as a man who had accepted bribes to commit inconvenient women to asylums on fraudulent diagnoses. "Dr. Morrison," the federal prosecutor asked, "how many women did you commit to the territorial asylum between 1850 and 1865? "I don't recall the exact number. According to asylum records, you committed 43 women during that period. Of those, 37 were either widows or wives of men who had disputed land claims with mining or railroad interests. Do you consider that a coincidence?" Dr. Morrison's face had gone ashen. "Mental illness affects all segments of society, including women who happen to possess documentation of fraudulent land surveys, women who claimed their husbands had been poisoned, women who accused territorial officials of corruption." The prosecutor's voice rose with each question. Or were these women simply inconvenient witnesses who needed to be silenced? When Judge Morrison took the stand, his testimony proved even more damaging to the defense. Under oath, he was forced to admit that he had processed land transfers without proper documentation, approved mineral rights based on surveys he knew were fraudulent, and signed commitment orders without personally examining the alleged patients. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said with heavy irony, "in how many cases did you rule against mining or railroad interests in land disputes during your tenure on the territorial bench? I don't see how that's relevant. Please answer the question." Judge Morrison squirmed visibly. "The law requires that proper procedures be followed." 0 cases, isn't that correct? In 20 years on the bench, you never once ruled against the mining or railroad interests that were systematically stealing land from legitimate property owners. But it was Governor Hayes who provided the most devastating testimony, not through his words, but through his obvious guilt. When confronted with bank records showing payments from mining companies into his personal accounts, he could offer no explanation beyond claims that they were legitimate consulting fees for unspecified services. Governor Hayes, what consulting services did you provide to the Morrison Mining Company worth $5,000 in 1863? I don't recall the specific. According to territorial records, that payment was made 3 days after you signed the order seizing the Morrison property for unpaid taxes. The same property that Morrison Mining purchased at auction for a fraction of its value 1 week later. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? The courtroom was utterly silent as Hayes struggled to respond. Finally, he resorted to the defense that had protected him for decades. These accusations are the fantasies of a madwoman, supported by forged documents and coached testimony. Federal Judge Harrison had heard enough. Governor Hayes, the documents in question have been verified by federal experts. The handwriting analysis on Thomas Granger's journal confirms its authenticity, as do the dates, inks, and papers used. As for Mrs. Granger's testimony, it has been corroborated by multiple independent sources, including Asylum staff, who are now willing to speak publicly about the conditions they witnessed. Mary Catherine was called back to the stand for final testimony. As she walked past the defendant's table, Silas noticed that none of them could meet her eyes. These powerful men who had destroyed her life couldn't face the woman they had tried to bury. Mrs. Granger, Judge Harrison, said gently, "You have endured 30 years of imprisonment for trying to expose this conspiracy. What would you consider appropriate justice in this case?" Mary Catherine looked out at the packed courtroom, at the faces of other victims who had finally found their voice, at her son who had risked everything to support her quest for truth. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 decades of suffering transformed into purpose. "Your Honor, I don't want revenge. I want restoration. I want every family that was cheated to receive compensation. I want every fraudulent land grant overturned and the property returned to its rightful owners. I want the truth told publicly so this can never happen again." She paused, looking directly at Governor Hayes. "Most of all, I want these men to understand that stealing someone's land isn't just theft. It's stealing their children's future, their family's legacy, their place in the world. They turned human beings into commodities to be bought and sold, and for that, they should lose everything they built on other people's stolen dreams." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "Mrs. Granger, this court finds your testimony credible and compelling. The evidence you and your family preserved has exposed a conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of territorial government." He turned to face the defendants. "Gentlemen, you stand accused of systematic fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, abuse of authority, and criminal conspiracy spanning multiple decades. The evidence against you is overwhelming and irrefutable." The judge's gavel came down with the force of 30 years of delayed justice. This court finds sufficient evidence to refer this matter to federal prosecutors for criminal charges. Additionally, all land grants, mineral rights, and property transfers connected to this conspiracy are hereby declared null and void, pending individual review and restoration to legitimate owners. In that moment, the old order died, and something new was born from its ashes. 2 years later, Silas stood in the doorway of the restored cabin where he'd been born, watching his mother tend a small garden she'd planted among the wildflowers. The house had been rebuilt with care and attention to detail, preserving the character of the original structure while adding modern comforts. Mary Catherine had insisted on living here rather than in his mansion, saying she wanted to be close to her husband's grave and the land they'd fought so hard to protect. The legal proceedings had taken 18 months to fully resolve, but the results had been everything Mary Catherine had hoped for and more. Governor Hayes, Judge Morrison, Dr. Morrison, and 14 other conspirators had been sentenced to federal prison terms ranging from 5 to 20 years. Their personal assets had been seized to provide compensation for victims, and the fraudulent land grants they'd orchestrated were systematically overturned. The Morrison family got their mine back, Mary Catherine said, looking up from her flowers as Silas approached. Sarah Kellerman's father finally received justice, even if he didn't live to see it. Silas nodded, still adjusting to the changed landscape of Colorado Territory. With the conspiracy exposed and its leaders imprisoned, legitimate property owners were reclaiming their stolen land, and new settlers were arriving to take advantage of honest opportunities for advancement. The territory's application for statehood, delayed for years by federal concerns about corruption, was moving forward again. "Any regrets about giving up so much of your empire?" Mary Catherine asked with a gentle smile. Silas considered the question carefully. The federal investigation had revealed that roughly half of his holdings had been acquired through fraudulent grants or from families who'd been illegally driven from their land. He'd voluntarily returned those properties to their rightful owners, keeping only what he could prove he'd obtained through legitimate means. His remaining ranch was still substantial, about 8,000 acres of prime grazing land, but nothing compared to the vast holdings he'd once controlled. "No regrets," he said finally. "What I kept, I earned honestly. What I gave back was never really mine to begin with." The silver deposits his father had discovered were now yielding their promised wealth, but under federal oversight that ensured the profits were shared fairly among legitimate claimants. Silas had used his portion to establish a fund that provided assistance to other victims of the conspiracy, helping displaced families reclaim their property or start over elsewhere. Miguel appeared around the corner of the house, walking with only a slight limp that remained from his injuries. He'd recovered completely from the assault and had chosen to stay on as foreman even after learning that Silas's reduced operation could afford to pay him only a fraction of his former salary. "Boss, there's a telegram for you from Denver," Miguel said, offering a yellow envelope. "Federal Marshal brought it personally." Silas opened the telegram and read it twice before the full meaning sank in. "The territorial legislature has voted to create a new county, Pine County, with its seat in the town they're calling Granger. They're naming a town after our family." Mary Catherine's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been pride. According to this, the federal government wants someone to serve as the first county sheriff. Someone with local knowledge and a reputation for honest dealing. Silas looked up from the telegram. "They're offering me the position." Mary Catherine set down her gardening tools and walked over to take the telegram from his hands. As she read it, her expression shifted from surprise to deep satisfaction. "Your father always believed that justice was something you had to fight for, not something that just happened on its own," she said. "He'd be proud to know his son was chosen to help establish honest law enforcement in the place where he died, trying to expose corruption." Silas thought about the offer as they walked together toward the small cemetery where his father was buried. The headstone was new, carved from good granite with Thomas Edgar Granger's name and dates, along with the inscription, "He preserved the truth so others might find justice." "It would mean giving up ranching entirely," Silas said. "Starting over in a completely different profession." "You've started over before." Mary Catherine's voice carried the wisdom of someone who had rebuilt her life from nothing more than determination and truth. "Besides, law enforcement isn't so different from ranching. Both require understanding people, managing conflict, and protecting what's valuable." They stood beside his father's grave in comfortable silence, 3 generations of Grangers finally at peace. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, and in the distance, Silas could see cattle grazing peacefully in meadows that belonged to their rightful owners. "There's something else," Mary Catherine said quietly. "Something I've been meaning to tell you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the tarnished silver locket Silas remembered from his childhood. With careful fingers, she opened it for the first time in his presence, revealing 2 tiny photographs, one of his father as a young man, the other of Silas himself at age 6, gap-toothed and grinning. "I kept these through everything," she said, placing the locket in his hands. Through the worst days in the asylum, through the years when I thought I might never see you again, through all the times when giving up would have been easier than holding on. They reminded me that love is stronger than hate, that truth is more powerful than lies, and that justice, however long delayed, is always worth fighting for. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Silas made his decision. He would accept the position of county sheriff, trading his spurs for a badge and his cattle empire for the chance to build something better, a community founded on honesty rather than theft, justice rather than corruption. His mother had spent 30 years preserving the truth so he could reclaim it. Now it was his turn to preserve it for the next generation. Some legacies were measured in acres and gold, but the best ones were measured in the simple promise that tomorrow's children would inherit a better world than their parents had found. The ghost of his mother's voice had led him home. At last. The end.